I'm coming not knowing very much about realism, but it does seem to me that great evil could be done through realism just as through idealism, or even a combination of the two. So maybe if you could sort for me a little bit, at least your perspective of where you walk, you know, a good line between those.
Try to keep the lecture brief, Alan.
I asked a simple question. Look, there's a distinction.
It's a false dichotomy, put it that way. It's a false dichotomy.
Yeah.
All foreign policies are informed by fundamental values of the cultures in which nation states or ruling elites arise and from which they make foreign policy. But there's all sorts of contradictions, especially in the application. So regardless of what the motives are, let's say that your motive, at least in public, the rationale, is we're going to prevent a communist dictatorship from arising in Chile. Well, then in application, you can have a so-called realist like Henry Kissinger who says we can't allow a country, Chile, to go communist due to the irresponsibility of its own people for having voted for a socialist government. What's the outcome? Mass murder backed by the United States when it overthrew the Allende government in 1973. I was there, it was pretty nasty, and implemented a dictatorship under Pinochet. Okay? So regardless of the motivation may be perfectly wonderful, at least in the abstract. But the implications for people can be very different. Okay? And it's not just a matter of unintended consequences. In large part, it's how the public is sold on the idea, for example, to go to war. In the case of Iraq, it's pretty clear from this film and from the other evidence that it alludes to that they committed crimes of torture in part to try to create the fabricated evidence they couldn't find to justify after the fact a war, an aggressive war, that was sold on false pretenses. Where after WMD, we're going to save you from WMD that Hussein is developing. That was clearly a lie. But it was a lie that was committed, supposedly with wonderful intentions, and in fact, the lie itself led to the greater crime, or a subsidiary crime, if you will, of torturing people to try to get them to say, yeah, there were WMD there. And on it goes. So I would simply say ignore the labels of realism, so-called, and idealism the way they're used here in an oversimplified way, and instead try to strip away the rationale of the policy and look at its actual effects. And then compare that to how it's sold, because this stuff is being done in our name. And if we are in fact a democracy, which I think is challengeable as a premise, then we have a responsibility to see to it that the people that we put in office, when they are caught lying and committing terrible crimes, aggressive war, a war crime, right? The greatest crime against humanity, and torture in order to justify an aggressive war, that they need to be brought to account. Because otherwise, people around the world are right to conclude, well, they're doing this in your name, and therefore, if you don't do something about it, you must approve. So, to me, that is the underlying moral and ethical question that is thrown back to us, living in an ostensibly democratic society, that this is crime that's done ostensibly for our benefit, and definitely done in our name.
If I could add just...
Well said.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's beautifully said,
Yeah.
and it gets everything that one needs, which is Kissinger, when he said this horrible anti-democratic thing,